seems most likely to me is that this is a kind of semi-deliberate leak, if you like, that serves as a warning to Israel, and particularly the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, which the White House doesn't like very much, to say, we've discussed this. We know what we think. We know what you're doing. You've told us what you said you're going to do. We're just keeping an eye on you and making sure that your preparations are indeed what you've told us.
We've had this leak of US intelligence documents, and it suggests that Israel has been planning for a retaliation to Iran. What was included in these documents, and what do we know so far?
So these documents come from something called the Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which is a posh name for a bit of the Pentagon that looks at satellite pictures, and it looks at 2 days, October the 15th and 16th last week, and what Israel was up to in its military bases, basically. And there are 2 pages for this document. There are no satellite pictures in it. There's just the analysis of what was seen. It focuses on the fact that there were some kind of military exercises being conducted that involved fighter bombers armed with airborne ballistic missiles, 16 Golden Horizon ballistic missiles, and also 40 ISO-2 missiles, bombs, they're a new type of bomb that's come onto the market. They're American supplied. They came on the market in the last few years. They have been used once or twice before. But, their precise, capabilities aren't fully studied. But the important thing is that overall, this picture, along with, the other thing they had was refueling tankers. So these are planes. They're going to be flying a long way, for example, to Iran. They'll need refueling, and they're going to drop bombs and also fire from presumably further off ballistic missiles. The important thing is the size of this package, if you like. If that's all that Israel's going to do, then that kind of falls in the medium range of what Israel's retaliation could be. There's no indication from that they're going to try and wipe out Iran's nuclear program, which would require much more firepower than that. The documents themselves compare it to a strike in September on Yemen, where Israel retaliated for a drone attack on Israel by the Houthi rebels, who are an Iran-backed group in Yemen, who've also been attacking Western shipping and shipping that's heading for Israel in the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea. So that would not be a huge operation, be substantial. Those are, quite big armaments. Partly would depend, of course, on where they were aimed at, and the assumption is if they all got through, of course, they could do quite a substantial amount of damage to Iranian military bases. But that would be medium level response by Iran, as it wouldn't be a total destruction of its nuclear program, which is what America is afraid that Israel will try to do. So the only question really is, was there anything else that Israel is planning that wasn't picked up? I suppose it's possible that there were other exercises, other military bases, but then you'll think, well, why was this leaked and not that? But then there's also the question of assassinations, cyber attacks, both of which are things that Israel have done pretty successfully against Iran in the past. So combine all those together with what was picked up by this intelligence, then you've got a fairly substantial attack.
And as you mentioned, there wasn't any indications about what or where they were targeting. But could we take an educated guess as to where this attack may take place? And also, when we talk about the scale of this attack as well, could you give us some detail into the impact that last attack had in Yemen?
Well, this is the $1 million question. The Yemen attack was just basically attacked the port at Hodeidah, the big port in Yemen, which is the main supply line to the country as a whole, particularly during the civil war. When Yemen has become divided, Hodeidah is the main port serving the north of the country, which is the area that's Houthi controlled. So that's where its food comes in from, but it's also where it's getting, one assumes, its weapons from Iran. The Houthis are getting their weapons from Iran. So that was a fairly significant but concentrated blow. There were other sites hit as well. as you say, the $1 million question is what targets are they trying to hit? Now, obviously, if they went after Iran's oil installations, for example, this kind of weaponry can cause an enormous amount of damage to Iran's main oil refinery at Karg Island or its port at Bandar Abbas and other places associated with the oil industry. I mean, you could really do a substantial amount of damage because oil facilities by their nature are quite concentrated. Now, if you were going to go after the entire extent of Iran's military program, you'll probably need to do use more than this to take out all of it, unless you were very clever. And I say unless there are other things which haven't been picked up by the satellite imagery. My assumption, if this is the extent of it, is that there's going to be, as I say, there's probably going to be a combined attack involving, maybe a longer range assassination program, but a cyber attack and this program together could, between them, cause a severe weakening of Iran's military installations if it's successful, and Israel tend to be quite successful at these operations. So I suspect that's what we're looking at is a degrading of Iran's military abilities, but not a total wipeout.
And another big question is, when would this potential attack happen? And it's been around 3 weeks since Iran fired around 180 ballistic missiles at Israeli cities and bases. And we haven't seen a retaliation yet. But why do you think it's potentially taken so long so far?
Well, I think they want to keep the suspense going. And of course, what we have to remember about Israel is that, because Israel fights wars on so many fronts, we tend to divide them up. I mean, partly the attention span of the media and its users, likes the idea of breaking it up, so we, don't get bored with Gaza and then don't get bored with Lebanon, so let's all move on to Iran. That's how we operate. But of course, Israel sees it very differently. Israel and the Israelis, for them it's much more integrated. So one advantage for them, I mean, it's a kind of fairly crude, calculated advantage. If you have these wars on different fronts, you can distract from what you're doing on one front with diverting attention to another front. So at the moment, it's conducting a war on two fronts already with Gaza and Lebanon, and having a lot of attention over a long period of time, focusing on the Iran threat and so on. Is distracting people in the West, particularly from bad publicity for what's happening in Gaza. And the publicity is now pretty bad for Israel. The Western powers are kind of fed up with what Israel is doing in Gaza, let alone everybody who isn't naturally a friend of Israel. So the longer you can string that out, the more you can get on with what you want to do in Gaza and Lebanon with attention somewhat distracted.
Do you think that this intelligence leak could impact or delay Israel's response to Iran?
Yeah, there's a lot of people, because the leak doesn't show anything hugely hugely surprising. This is pretty much what we'd expect Israel to be doing, preparing for carrying out exercises in advance of a multi-pronged attack on Iran. So there's been a lot of tension on why these documents leaked. Was it a someone who didn't like Israel, who wanted to leak to Iran as a warning to them, or my slightly more, individual response. I haven't seen many other people coming up with this, but it seems most likely to me is that this is a kind of semi-deliberate leak, if you like, that serves as a warning to Israel, and particularly the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, which the White House doesn't like very much, to say, we've discussed this, we know what we think, we know what you're doing, you've told us what you said you're going to do, we're just keeping an eye on you and making sure that your preparations are indeed what you've told us they are. We're keeping an eye on things. That's my suspicion. So I think that's the aim, is sort of to try and keep Netanyahu on the to the agreement he's made clearly with President Biden over what his response will be. Biden said himself on Friday that he knew what Israel was going to do and when, but wasn't going to tell anyone. So I suspect it hasn't change things that much. I may be wrong. It may be that Israel wants to get on with it now because it's afraid of more leaks. But I suspect this is slightly choreographed, and Israel will do it in its own time, which I guess won't be too far off. But it's never any great hurry. There's no particular reason to hurry these things.
Mm. And if you are correct with that theory, what do you think this says about the relationship between Netanyahu and Biden?
I think the important thing to remember. I mean, so much is written about Israel and America as if it's just as if they're a constant, and it is a fairly constant relationship with American support for Israel, at least in the last couple of decades. But that is subject to the vagaries of individuals and individual administrations. Netanyahu is a very tough cookie. That's one way of putting it. He's very good at manipulating public opinion. He's very good at manipulating the people he works with. He's a very canny political operator. He's been Prime Minister of Israel on and off since 1996. He was first elected. Even before that, he was very well versed in American politics. He'd been a diplomat in Washington, and he'd been educated in America. He's obviously fully bilingual, as we all know. He understands how American politics works, and he uses that to his advantage, and as he sees it, Israel's advantage. So he's very good at sort of striking a deal with not just his enemies, but who he doesn't strike deals with, but with his friends, like America. He's done the same with Britain in the past, where you think you've got a deal, and then he's always pushing that extra mile where he's left a little loophole for himself. And that kind of infuriates his partners in the West. It's infuriated British foreign ministers in the past, and it's infuriated presidents of America in the past. So Biden is a long-standing friend of Israel. There's never any doubt that he's not going to. There's never any doubt that he's going to support Israel. At the end of the day, he's carried on the weapons supplies. He's made it fairly clear that whatever happens, that will continue. So if he's not going to end the weapons supplies, what leverage does he have over Netanyahu to show that he's aware of this tendency in the way Netanyahu operates and try to limit it? And this is, if I am right, I mean, it's only a conspiracy theory, but if I am right, then this is one way. Well, it's one way that if I were president, that I would use.
In terms of what we know so far and what's suggested in these intelligence documents, and especially looking at the scale at which this promised attack could happen on Iran, what would be the significance of this attack, especially in terms of the war so far?
Right. So this is, it has been pretty clear from the night of that ballistic missile attack that this is a key moment, not only for the Gaza war, but for the Middle East, perhaps the wider world. We've talked about this since the beginning of this conflict in Gaza. What is the chance of this escalating into a wider war? There are voices in Israel, there are voices in Washington that say that Iran is the single casus belli, is the motive factor that threatens Israel, therefore threatens, in American and Israeli views, peace in the Middle East. That if you somehow defang Iran, the Islamic Republic, which has the destruction of Israel as part of its core ideology, and to achieve which it's funded all these militias across the Middle East, in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, now Yemen. Certainly the Hamas and Hezbollah, most importantly at the moment. If you defang Iran, you can really reshape the Middle East and lower the threat to Israel. And if you're an idealist, then maybe try and create a more peaceful Middle East at the end of it. That's the hawkish view. The dovish view, which is the view of President Biden, is that if you try and do that, there will be a massive reaction. Iran will attack American interests across the Middle East, including American allies. America has bases within very close range of Iran. It has central command. One of the three main branches of the American military is based in Qatar. It's got the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. It's got military bases elsewhere. Very easy targets for Iran and, of course, its allies as well. Saudi Arabia, UAE. are all very close to Iran. So so Biden is saying don't do anything that would trigger an Iranian escalation into all-out war. The idea that Iran would say, well, if you're going to come after us as a regime, try and topple us as the Islamic Republic, we will go down fighting. That's a very dangerous moment for the Middle East. But there are voices pushing to call Iran's bluff as they see it on that one. So this is why we are where we are in these negotiations. As I say, underlying this leak, in my view, is my view, and it's only speculation, but it seems to be what I would read from these documents and the way they were leaked, is that Biden has won an agreement from Netanyahu that Netanyahu will push his response to the limits of what Iran can accept without broadening the war. So I think if he does this, and again, this is the other thing the documents show, is how Israel is preparing for a response. I think the agreement is that Israel will strike Iran in such a way that if Iran does retaliate, it will only retaliate again by striking back at Israel. So what you've seen is, again from these documents, is the Israeli Navy dispersing from the big port at Haifa. It's moving some of its nuclear-capable missiles out of the way into hiding, into underground bunkers, we presume. It doesn't make quite clear what they're doing with them, but it's certainly dispersing them. So it's preparing for an Iranian response on Israel. My suspicion is that this implies, the corollary is this implies that the deal that Biden has struck with Netanyahu is that there won't be an attack of the scale that would broaden the war. That's my reading of this, but it's speculation. But that's what I would read from these documents.
Israel has delayed its retaliatory strike against Iran because of a leak last week of potentially sensitive military information from the US. The leak revealed Israel's well-advanced plans to respond to a salvo of nearly 200 Iranian ballistic missiles fired against it earlier this month, which was in itself a retaliation by Tehran for Israel's attacks on its Middle Eastern proxy groups. And it comes as negotiations over a potential Gaza ceasefire and hostage release deal are set to resume in Doha in Qatar in the coming days. Let's talk to Cedric Leighton, who is a former US colonel and member of the Joint Staff of the Pentagon, now CNN's military analyst. Cedric, hello and welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Henry. Good to be with you.
Now, it's really good to talk about this, particularly at this time. What do you think is going on? Why has Israel delayed its retaliatory strike that some analysts were very, very concerned about the depth, concerned about the scale of it?
Yeah, there's several reasons, I think. One of them may be logistical, in that the Israelis need to figure out exactly what kinds of forces they're going to be employing, what kinds of targets they're going to be hitting, and when they're going to do that. So part of that, one thing affects the other, and everything affects the timetable. So that might part of it. The other aspect of this, Henry, could be that they are looking at it from the standpoint of where can they achieve the greatest influence without creating the greatest change in behavior in Iran, without creating a major escalation. And that is, something that, if they do it that way, they're going to need to calibrate exactly what they're going to hit. And the other part of that calibration is if they fulfill the promises that they have reportedly made to President Biden and to Secretary Blinken of the United States, they will not hit the nuclear installations, the research facilities, or the installations themselves, or any oil terminals and oil-related facilities. So if they avoid those targets, that may require a reassessment of what targets they actually can hit, how many, and how often.
Well, some people might say, well, if they're avoiding those targets, what can they possibly hope to achieve if the aim is to change Iranian behavior?
Well, that actually is a really good question. So I think the effect would be limited if the Israelis stick to that idea where they don't hit the nuclear targets or the oil targets. My suspicion is that they might try to hit some of the shipping areas in the Persian Gulf, or they might try to hit some of the military installations both along the Persian Gulf coast as well as of the ones that are inland, such as an air base, maybe the one around Esfahan, for example. But that, of course, remains to be seen, and that's not something that the Israelis have revealed to anybody yet.
And the Times has reported that the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and its paramilitary force, the Basij, force of volunteers, are considered to be likely targets. They will surely not wait and be sitting ducks. They will make preparations, won't they?
Normally they would, and the Basij especially have been pretty good at limiting exposure to Israeli strikes. They know how to live again another day, and they are able to really work around a lot of the Israeli strikes. So if it's the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, specifically the Basij, then it would be something that not only would it be survivable for them, but they would definitely be able to have the right camouflage, have the right dispersion techniques, all of those kinds of things that would make it at least a bit more difficult for the Israelis, but not impossible for the Israelis to cause some major damage there.
And as people might expect, there's a major leak investigation by the FBI and I presume the Pentagon as well. What do we know? Is there a prime suspect?
Well, there have been some suspects that have been mentioned, some of them on social media, but then when you dig a little bit deeper, it seems as if those people actually aren't suspects. So that gets to very dangerous territory where people are being accused without actually, perhaps having committed any particular crime or this particular leak. So it seems as if, based on discussions I've had with Pentagon officials, they're no closer to finding a particular person now than they were compared to yesterday or the day before.
And I see that Prime Minister Netanyahu told Secretary of State Blinken during their meeting in Israel that the Hezbollah drone that struck his home at the weekend was, and I quote, an issue of dramatic significance that cannot be ignored. And he says, the US and Israel need to join forces against Iran. What more does he want, do you think, from the US?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and he's using the drone attack on his residence as, basically an excuse for, more basically the basis for a plea to create more of a synergy between the U.S. and Israel. The U.S. does not want to get involved in a war with Iran, and it's doing everything it can to avoid any escalation in the Middle East. And now we're dependent on what the Israelis do and, of course, how the Iranians respond. What more would Netanyahu want? Perhaps more weapons, perhaps the ability to fly his air forces in an area where they've previously had denied access. Those are the kinds of things that he might want. And a lot of that actually depends not just on the U.S., but on what the Arab nations do and say in this particular regard.
And finally, Cedric, I mean, Iran was one of the, 36 countries that was represented in Russia at the BRICS meeting in Kazan. And the Russians wanted to show the West that we're not isolated. And the Iranians, I'm sure, would be pleased to rub soldiers with dozens of other world leaders. What do you think this might do to the calculation, due to the sense that Iran is not on its own, it has allies?
Well, that is actually a very interesting point, because what it shows is that Iran's relationship with Russia is definitely in the ascendancy. The president of Iran, prior to the BRICS meeting, the president of Iran met with President Putin. They are clearly engaged in helping the Russians in Ukraine with the Shahid drones, as well as other support. And what it seems to me is that that relationship has become much more formalized. So you see Iran and, by extension, North Korea being drawn into a closer orbit with the Russians, and that could also give pause to the Israelis. It might mean that they either delay or modify some of their target planning processes, and time goes on, it of course becomes a less strident effort, and becomes an effort that is perhaps more of an afterthought than a main goal for the Israeli military.
Welcome to the program, Alex Vatanka. Can I ask you, first of all, how you view the significance of these new attacks across Beirut, and what their impact will be on the financial sector?
Carol, it's great to be with you. Look, I mean, clearly the Israeli state and certainly Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government are interested in going toward this decapitation strategy, if you like, against Hezbollah, in this case in Lebanon. But I think broadly speaking, if they can get it done, they want to broaden that to go after every single member of the Iran-backed axis of resistance that are in the business essentially of fighting Israel. Now, as you just pointed out, the last set of Israeli actions have been targeting the financial activities of Hezbollah. So I assume what is happening here is that the decapitation strategy, if you will, is not just aimed at personnel, but also as the capacity of Hezbollah as an organization to operate. It is a state within a state in the country of Lebanon. A lot of people depend on Hezbollah for their livelihood. I assume still to this day, despite the massive amounts of damage that Israel's done to Hezbollah in the last few months, that the organization still has sort of a segment of population that it has to cater to, deliver for, and financial services part of that. So I think what the Israelis are doing is just to overall weaken, tighten, if you will, the noose around the neck of Hezbollah. Whether they'll succeed or not, obviously, is a slightly different matter, but that's what Israel's been doing from what I can tell.
Is there any sense of Hezbollah pulling back, retreating further back into Lebanon, or still continuing to fire weapons into Israel?
My reading just coming on just a few minutes ago was that Hezbollah has continued to fire rockets, saying that they're doing that in retaliation to Israeli strikes. And we have right now, again, as you pointed out, the Secretary of State of the United States, Tony Blinken, in the region. The Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi is continuing his regional tour from last week. I understand he was in Bahrain and Kuwait. So both sides, the U.S. and Iran in this case, are still pushing for that ceasefire, if you will. How genuine these efforts are depends who you ask. But I certainly think I haven't changed my mind sitting here in Washington. The United States doesn't want to see that broader regional war. And I frankly don't think the Iranian regime is interested in that either. So the question is, what would it take for Israel to say, okay, we've won rounds, one round after another in recent months, maybe it's time for us to stop. Or perhaps they decide that, it's not enough, that they want to go and continue the strategy against the axis of resistance in the foreseeable future.
That is the biggest question, isn't it? What will draw this to a close? And we know that Antony Blinken, this is his 11th visit since the 7th of October. Peace plans have been talked about. We've thought that we were close and we weren't. Do you think that there's any difference this time?
To be honest, I mean, one of the criticism you can level at the door of this White House, the Biden presidency, is that they haven't really gotten the messaging right. So the United States looks weaker every time the U.S. promises a ceasefire and it doesn't happen. I don't know if it's going to be different this time around. Obviously, we're only a few weeks away from the U.S. election, so nothing major on the U.S. part is going to happen in the Middle East. But again, the Israelis will tell you they will do what they have to do from their national interest point of view. They're not going to sit here and wait for Washington. Again, that's their public messaging. But in reality, Israel has a lot to lose if there is too much distance between what they're doing and American support for them, because Israel obviously is much stronger facing its enemies when the United States has its back. And the question right now for Netanyahu is, what would it take for him to continue to have this Biden administration's support in what they're doing towards their enemies in the axis of resistance?
And how do you assess the threat from the United States to perhaps put a limit on the amount of military aid sent to Israel if Netanyahu didn't allow more humanitarian aid into northern Gaza? Do you think that has worked as a threat from the United States, or is Benjamin Netanyahu just ignoring now the word that comes from the US and UK allies?
That's an important question here. Obviously, the United States is in a tough position because what is happening right now in Gaza and Lebanon is increasingly turning public opinion around the world also against the United States as the closest ally of Israel. So the U.S. is concerned about this. But at the same time, as we've heard from officials in the administration, Israel is simply too close of an ally, as it was put recently in a report quoting an official from the Biden administration, too close of an ally to withhold weapons to Israel. So, again, I think the United States has done a better job in terms of shaping Israel's decision-making when it comes to the mother of all battles, that against Iran. And there, the American side has made it very clear they're not interested in, for example, Israel going after Iran's nuclear facilities. For sure, the United States is not going to help that. We see much more of a proactive U.S. position when it comes to Israel going after that fight against Iran. Much less clarity in terms of really what U.S. position is when it comes to Hamas and the situation in Gaza.
Would you have expected some sort of response from Israel to Iran by now? And does it give you hope then that there has been a longer gap than expected between the strike from Iran and the expected response from Israel?
You know, the Israelis are basically playing the same game that Iran played back in April. It took the Iranians about a month to retaliate after Israel struck their embassy in Damascus. And, you know, if eventually that strike, that retaliation from Iran did come, it wasn't much of a success. I think the Israelis right now feel that perhaps, you know, waiting and preparing a strike or retaliation against Iran that is strategically significant is important than just you know, striking as fast as they can. Clearly, Israel has a capacity and has had plenty of time to prepare to strike Iran. The question for them is, what's the best kind of response to the latest round of Iranian missile attack on October 1st? And you just had in the United States intelligence reports, government intelligence reports being leaked in terms of what Israel's doing, you know, ballistic missiles and so forth being planned to used against Iranian sites. The big question right now in Washington is who leaked it and why? Is this some kind of a orchestrated U.S. government, you know, attempt to press the Israelis not to go ahead with some of their plans? Or something else is going on. But I will say this, Carolyn, that I think, you know, obviously that Israeli retaliation will come. We just have to wait and see when it happens and what sort of shape it will take.
Interesting question you ask about who leaked highly classified US intelligence documents. Indeed, that is really a question. Just going back to the killing of Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader, that was regarded by so many people as a moment. But do you think it's shifted the dial at all?
Look, if you look at the totality of the history of this conflict, going back to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, we've had so many rounds where significant members of what the Arab side, the Palestinians call resistance leaders, have been killed, have been taken out of the game by Israel, only to be replaced. So I'm not so sure if the death of Sinwar is going to be a game changer. I think somebody will come in and fill his shoes. The question is this the moment for Israel, for supporters of Israel and the region to sort of say, okay, this is a moment, this is an opportunity, let's have a ceasefire, let's quickly move ahead, you know, deal with the problem of Islamist militants that believe every solution to every problem out there is militancy, the way the axis of resistance essentially believes. Let's fight that. But at the same time, let's seriously push ahead with the idea of a Palestinian state. Obviously, the Israeli society right now is wholly against the idea of a Palestinian state, but that is something that at some point needs to be introduced to prevent the future Yahya Sinwars of this world to be born. And
Benjamin Netanyahu, his popularity has risen and fallen in recent times, hasn't it? Now we hear a story that Israel's arrested 7 Israeli citizens on spying charges for Iran. How concerning do you think this will be to Benjamin Netanyahu, and to what extent does it reflect his popularity among Israelis?
Look, I don't think necessarily that's a reflection of what Israel, in terms of society, has in terms of views on the prime minister. He's got all sorts of other issues he has to deal with. This probably is not going to be one of them. I suspect, based on the reports I've seen, the individuals involved in this aren't doing this for ideological reasons. They're doing it for financial reasons. So essentially, you know, opportunistic acts. That's not unheard of, obviously. Intelligence communities around the world do that. The money is used as an incentive. You recruit. The fact that Iran is able to do it more and more is somewhat a surprise. Israel is a pretty, you know, in terms of security, pretty tight show. It's this, to give you an example, there's one international airport into the country. It's very difficult to sort of just walk into Israel, if you will, compared to Iran, where, you know, essentially borders are open. So I look at this set of reports and saying to myself, well, it obviously reflects an intensification of an Iranian desire to find recruits among the Jewish part of the Israeli population. That's happening. But how far they can continue going down this path, just using financial incentives, Again, I don't think that that's going to be much of a pool that they can sort of draw from. And I think obviously now that the Israeli state is sort of awakened to this reality, the likes of Shin Bet, whose job it is to monitor counterintelligence operations, they'll be that much more watchful in terms of what's happening. But again, look, when there are so much money at stake and two countries are so against one another, as the case with Israel and Iran, they'll throw anything they have to hurt each other. And we're just seeing this happening in this new arena, the most recent area of competition, if you will, between the two sides.
Noga Tanalski is an Israeli-Palestinian journalist based in Jerusalem, and she joins us now. Noga, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Noga, what has been the fallout for the people of Israel after Thursday's events, and particularly after that speech from the Prime Minister?
Well, it was a very, kind of jubilant speech in a way. The getting Sinwar was one of Netanyahu's principal aims and one of the war aims since the attack of October 7th last year. And I have to say that there are a lot of critics in Israel, principally retired generals, who have been very, very wary of this sort of triumphalism all along, because history shows in this region that when you decapitate a terror organization, its next leader is all too often, even more vicious. Sinwar himself is an example of that. He came to lead Hamas after Israel bumped off his predecessors. So there has been a concern about it. But I want to return to your introduction because I think we should stop a moment. Hezbollah today managed to hit the private home of the Israeli Prime Minister. The extent of the security failure on Israel's part that allows something like that to happen is astonishing. And the Prime Minister, we have had so far no confirmation from the Israeli side that this happened, but it does appear absolutely that it did happen. The Prime Minister appears to have been at that residence. It's a kind of a luxury villa on the seaside in Caesarea. Very, very plush, very, very wealthy area. It's his private home. It's surrounded by almost, turrets, walls. It's the site of massive protests against the Prime Minister every weekend. The fact that Hezbollah had the ability not just to shoot a targeted missile and hit his house, but that there wasn't protection against it is just astonishing. Netanyahu has released 2 videos since then, I think to show that he's alive and unhurt. He apparently was at his Caesarea villa until sometime around 3 a.m., is what we're hearing. And then for reasons unknown, in his entire cavalcade took off for Jerusalem. So he was actually in Jerusalem when this happened. And he's released 2 videos to show that he is alive and undeterred.
Is that perhaps signs that the IDF are overstretched? Or is that, as you were saying, a sort of a very worrying just failure of national security?
It's a really good question. The Israeli army has not said a single thing today, except there was a statement. The entire Israeli north is under constant attack all this morning. You have millions of Israelis in bomb shelters this entire day thus far. The Israeli army did release a statement 45 minutes ago saying that until then, 180 projectiles, meaning missiles and drones, had been fired by Hezbollah and crossed into Israel. So that means that they actually fired more. Some didn't make it across because some were intercepted. Israel's under a massive barrage. I mean, what it does mean, among other things, is that Netanyahu's strategy or lack thereof for this war is offering Israelis a life of misery. I don't know how to stress that enough. It's not just the fact that his house was hit is a massive security failure, which I hope will be studied. It may be that the army's overstretched. It may be that the army still, despite the catastrophe of October 7th, 2023, doesn't yet fully grasp the real ambition and capacities of its enemies. Failure of imagination. But the fact of the matter is that a third of this country right now is either an internal refugee or, cowering in bomb shelters. And so what you see is a very unpopular prime minister. He's supposed to be providing testimony in his own corruption trial very soon, in 2 months, less than 2 months now. And he's trying everything to try and show that he's tough to his own Israeli base. But that strategy so far is really raining missiles down on his own people.
Noga, I was also wondering whether, looking at Gaza, you can shed a little bit of information on an article that appeared in the Times of Israel. This reported that almost a third of lawmakers in the Prime Minister's party were participating in an event that its motto was preparing to resettle Gaza. The idea that the way forward with Gaza would be to get Israeli settlers to start settling in the Gaza territory. What can you tell us about that event? And also, how significant is it that a third of the Prime Minister's party believe that Gaza is there to be settled in?
Well, obviously, I think that is quite significant. It's hard to know. The Prime Minister's party in total has less than around a quarter, I believe, of the seats in the Israeli parliament. The Prime Minister's party has about 32 seats. So a third of that, I think 8 or 9, if I'm not mistaken, ministers or legislators from his own party.
10 of them. Yeah, but 10 of the 32.
Yeah, there've been some discussion about that. But there are also, more significantly maybe, his coalition is made up of his party and then a collection of either kind of ultra-Orthodox, ultra-religious sectorial parties and extremist parties that were, basically made up of one of them a convicted former, a guy convicted of hate crimes and terror associations, really extremist, violent, nationalistic people who were kept out of the Israeli public sphere until Netanyahu brought them in. Again, going back to his trial, no one else would sit with him as an indicted criminal, not yet convicted, and so he brought in the sort of politicians who would join him. And almost all of them, meaning a huge majority of his coalition, representatives of his coalition, will be attending this conference. The Prime Minister, meanwhile, says out loud and openly in English to the Americans and to the rest of the world that, quote, Israel has no intention of occupying or resettling Gaza. But what he's doing inside Israel is allowing a major part of the population to at least fantasize that it's possible, to believe that it's possible.
Now, let's now speak with Ray Murphy, who served as an officer with the Irish contingent of UN peacekeepers in Lebanon in the 1980s. He's now a professor of human rights at the National University of Ireland. Ray, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for joining us.
Good afternoon, Aisha.
So tell us, what do you make of these recent incidents where we have seen, UN UNIFIL personnel coming under fire by Israeli troops? What do you make of it all?
Yeah, that's a very serious development because UNIFIL has been there since 1978. In 2006, it was reconstituted. It was given a new mandate, and its presence was supported by the Israelis, the Lebanese government, and its mandate was quite challenging and a compromise in the circumstances. But it's important to stress that the UN peacekeepers are protected persons. They have a special status. They're there at the behest of the United Nations under the authority of the Security Council. They do not play a combat role.
Okay.
Their positions are very vulnerable because one of their primary purposes is to show an international presence and be able to observe and report on what's happening. So they're not deployed as you would normally deploy a military force, taking the most easy positions to defend. They're often quite exposed and quite vulnerable, so they're easy targets.
They're easy. And Ray, could you just expand a wee bit there on just what are some of the practical things that they do? What's their role there?
Well, in theory, their role is set out in Resolution 1701, which was adopted in 2006. And it's quite a lengthy mandate, and some of its goals and aims are quite unrealistic. They were quite unrealistic in 2006, and they're even less realistic now. But one of its primary purposes is to maintain a degree of peace and security in the region by reporting on what's happening, observing what's happening, providing or facilitating humanitarian aid to local civilians. It was intended that it would oversee the disarmament of Hezbollah, and that Hezbollah would withdraw from the UNIFIL area of operations to a position north of the Litani River, which is about 20 or 30 kilometers north of the Israeli-Lebanese de facto border. And Hezbollah, of course, have never cooperated with UNIFIL on the ground. And in fact, not only did they not cooperate, they've been quite hostile. But now that Israel has invaded South Lebanon and is conducting extensive military operations throughout Lebanon, UNIFIL is essentially in the pathway of the Israeli advance, and Israel does not want to have an international presence because it does not want to be reported on by the UN. It does not want objective observers present. It wants to have free rein to do what it will in South Lebanon. And my fear is that if the current policy continues, it's inevitable that some UN troops will be killed or more seriously injured. And as I said, they're not there in a combat role. They're extraordinarily vulnerable, and they're there with the support of and on behalf of the United Nations and the international community. One other interesting fact about the UN force in South Lebanon, which makes it different than all other international peacekeeping, UN international peacekeeping operations, is it has a very significant European presence. There's a number of European states contributing, Ireland, Italy, France, to this peacekeeping force. And that's not an accident. That was at the insistence of Israel at that time. But it means that Israel is coming under a lot of pressure from Italy, Ireland, and France.
And Ray, Israel says that Hezbollah is using some of these peacekeepers, these UNIFIL peacekeepers, almost as a human shield, and is firing, quite close to them, and that they're being used by Hezbollah. That's what Israel is saying. What would you say to that?
Unfortunately, Hezbollah and other armed groups have used UN posts as a form of human shield. They would often come up right beside the post very quickly. They would launch a rocket or a mortar or some other weapon, and then they would be gone within minutes from that particular area, knowing that it would be very difficult to direct fire on that temporary position because of its proximity to the UN post. And only just over a week ago, 7 or 8 days ago, the Israelis set up a post alongside an Irish observation post that had 30 UN peacekeepers. And again, Israel was using the tactics of Hezbollah. It was using the post to shield their troops from being fired on by Hezbollah. Now, Israel, after some pressure, has moved that post and is no longer beside or adjacent to the Irish post. UNIFIL has made it clear, though, that it's not going to withdraw it's not going to withdraw. The Security Council and all of the members of the Security Council and all of the contributing states have stated that they intend to support UNIFIL and to keep it present in its current area of operations. The one possible compromise that might be necessary is because of the nature of a UN peacekeeping mission, there are some very vulnerable observation posts, and it might be necessary to redeploy from those posts to safer areas, for example, in a camp headquarters or something. But that would be a decision by the force commander and other commanders, and that would be a decision that I would respect from a distance because they're on the ground and they must decide But they must decide what is in the best interest of force protection. It's critical that we allow UNIFIL to protect itself, that to the extent possible, the troops are kept as safe and out of harm's way.
And final question to you. I mean, if the troops stay there, even though Israel is wanting them to go, do you think somebody is going to get killed? Do you think that's a likelihood?
I think it's very likely if Israel continues to disregard the UN presence. Now, the attacks that have taken place, the UN is on record of saying that they were deliberate, and certainly all of the evidence points to that conclusion. But even if the Israeli Defense Forces do not deliberately fire on the UN posts, they are in an extremely vulnerable position, almost like meat in a sandwich, caught between Hezbollah and the Israeli forces. So yes, they are very vulnerable, but if Israel is not more careful about ensuring the safety of the UN personnel and are reckless as to their well-being and safety, then I believe it is inevitable. And though Hezbollah has said it will not fire on any UN post and it will respect the presence of the UN peacekeepers, I would not rely on the word of Hezbollah. They are not a reliable partner, or they are an armed group in a very difficult situation and have not cooperated in the past with the UN presence.
First of all, then, Iran's Supreme Leader's intervention this morning. Hamas is alive and will remain alive. I suppose, in some ways, there is no doubt that that is true. Hamas clings to an ideology. It's difficult to eradicate that fully. What would you say, though, about the functionality of the terror group?
I think Iran's whole strategic way of thinking is building strategic decks through the building of Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis in Yemen. And Israel is eradicating systematically these terror organizations. Hamas has almost completely lost its capability to fight. We have seen the targeting of Sinwar, their leader. Following that, they couldn't even shoot one rocket. So I think that we are in a very advanced stage of dismantling Hamas as a terror army, but we need to still bring down Hamas also as a governmental entity. They are still controlling most of the Palestinian society, terrorizing them, shooting their own people, using them as human shields. And it's time to liberate them from Hamas. And the IDF systematically is dealing with that, targeting areas where Hamas is trying to regroup, but their capabilities are diminishing every day that goes by. They cannot renew themselves. They have no factories. They cannot smuggle any weapons anymore. So we have to take the time, and eventually they will lose the war.
Okay, I'm intrigued. There's lots to consider there. When you talk about Hamas as a governmental entity and sort of dismantling that, how does the IDF do that?
So I think the next challenge is really about the humanitarian aid. Throughout this war, humanitarian aid was simply sent into Gaza. Hamas seizes this aid. They take it for themselves instead for the citizens, and then they sell it for overpriced money to the citizens. This way they are controlling their own society. Now the challenge is, how do you manage to bring the aid to the citizens without Hamas seizing the aid? This is the challenge that the IDF and the Israeli government need to deal with. And we saw the Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he spoke at the UN, addressing this issue. They are working on a plan how to really detach Hamas from the society. It's a working process, and I believe that in the coming weeks and months we'll see a big change talking about that.
So it's interesting that. So the idea there that it's the distribution of aid that would tip sort of public opinion, I suppose, against Hamas, and therefore the political entity would cease to have any real influence over the people of Gaza.
So I think that the people of Gaza are really starting to get fed up with Hamas. Hamas is simply using them as a tool. They're not fighting for them. They're just using them.
Isn't there a risk, Amir, sorry to interrupt, just on that exact point, I take what you mean. They may be fed up with Hamas. They may also be getting extremely fed up with the IDF bombing Gaza to destruction and killing tens of thousands of people. I just wonder if the balance actually is at risk of tipping, and so it's not so much anti-Hamas as anti-IDF.
So we have to remember that when the IDF operates, we all the time ask the people to move from areas that we have to target Hamas. We put a big designated humanitarian zone where we are not operating and the Palestinians are safe. But in Jabalia, for example, we see Hamas shooting their own people, forcing them to stay because they want to use them as human shields. They are beating them. And I think that really there is a growing understanding that Hamas is the problem. Now, nobody can accuse Israel for going to a war which was unprovoked, but after killing 1,200 Israelis, raping women, burning people alive, decapitating heads of children. We have a right to defend ourselves, and I think they understand that. So I think we'll see a moment when the Palestinian society will rise against Hamas, and this is the day when Hamas will stop being also a governmental entity.
Understood. So then, that is what would be indicative of a win for Israel. Is that what would lead to the cessation of fighting? Because, as we say, in the last 48 hours or so, there has been growing and loud international pressure for Israel to stop now. But actually, are you saying that they are not at the point of being able to declare victory?
So, there are very clear goals of war, and we need to reach them. As long as we are not reaching the goals of war, we are not going to stop. It's eradicating Hamas as a military and governmental entity. It's bringing back all our hostages, 101 hostages. They need to come back home. There will be no stop of the war without the hostages being back home. And also, and this is maybe the more complicated issue, creating the terms that never again there will be a terror army in Gaza. So this requires long-term process, like de-radicalization of the society. How do you manage that? This is a long-term process, just as Britain and the US did at the end of the Second World War with the Nazis. You need to manage this process of de-radicalization, because if the society stays the same, radicalized, there will be no stop to this ongoing struggle between Palestinians and Israel.
Is the reality here, Amir, that this is about, at this point, who blinks first? So if Hamas are saying, we won't stop until the fighting stops and there's a ceasefire, and Israel are saying, we won't stop until there's a deal to release the hostages, that actually it's somebody has to blink first?
Well, it's not going to be Israel. Israel is going to continue until Hamas is eradicated, just as we set as a goal. And by the way, we're very close to eradicating them. I think that in this case...
What does eradication mean,
there
do you
needs
think?
to be...
Yeah.
Which means they completely lose their ability to fight. It means they have no leaders. And by the way, there are very few leaders left. Most of them were targeted. Not able to function, coordinate anything, not able to govern. And I think we're moving towards reaching these goals. But,
is it realistic to think that would be a new permanent sort of status of Hamas, if you like, that they would, once Israel gets to the point of saying we have eradicated Hamas, that they would never fight again?
Well, there will be a point where Hamas simply won't exist as a terror organization in Gaza. As you said at the beginning, we cannot kill the idea, but we can kill the terrorists. And so basically, we'll reach the point where Hamas is not controlling Gaza anymore, and there will be new leadership in Gaza, probably based on the local clans that run the cities. But even after that, the question is really, how do you change the education? How do you create a society that is really driven towards peace and not towards war? And this is a long-term challenge that will take probably many years.